What would you do if the world cast you out with nothing but the clothes on your back and a single silver dollar in your pocket? For 18-year-old Opal Sayers, in the humid summer of 1883, this was not a question, but the hard, dusty truth of her life. She had been given $1 by the woman who had married her father and buried him in the same year. A coin meant not as a kindness, but as the final metallic sound of a closing door. She was told to walk and not look back, and so she did, until her worn boots brought her to the edge of Havens Eddy, a Missouri River town that time had forgotten. The town slumped against the banks of the Osage River like a tired old man, its spine bent, its glory days a fading memory. But what Opal would purchase with that last lonely dollar, a derelict paddle barge rotting in the mud, held a secret that would not only rewrite her own future, but resurrect the soul of the town that had dismissed her. The truth was waiting, sealed in iron and darkness, ready to challenge everyone who believed some things and some people were beyond saving. Settle in and let us tell you her story. Opal Sayers arrived in Havens Eddy as the sun was bleeding out across the western sky, painting the muddy waters of the Osage in shades of rust and rose. She carried a small canvas satchel containing her mother's hymnal, a spare calico dress, and a half-eaten apple. The dust of the road caked her face and clung to the hem of her skirt. She had walked for 3 days, sleeping in barns and haylofts, the echo of her stepmother's voice a constant, bitter companion. "Your father left nothing," the woman had said, her face a mask of pinched propriety. "This house is mine. The world has no place for sentimental girls." Then came the silver dollar, dropped into Opal's palm without the warmth of human contact. A final transaction. A severance. Havens Eddy was not a destination she had chosen, but simply the place where her feet had finally refused to take another step. It was a town of ghosts. Faded signs for outfitters and river freight offices swung on rusted hinges, creaking a mournful tune in the evening breeze. The boardwalks were warped and splintered, and the few faces she saw peer from behind grime-streaked windows were hollowed out by a quiet desperation. The railroad had bypassed them a decade prior, and the river trade that had been the town's lifeblood had dwindled to the occasional flatboat carrying local timber. Hope, it seemed, had packed up and moved downriver long ago. The weight of that single silver dollar in her pocket felt heavier than all her other possessions combined. It was the last tangible piece of her old life, the final barrier between her and absolute destitution. As dusk deepened into a purple twilight, her gaze fell upon the town's disused landing. There, half swallowed by mud and tangled in willow roots, lay the skeletal remains of a paddle barge. Its paint was gone, weathered down to the silvered grain of the wood. Its great paddle wheel was frozen, choked with debris, and its deck sagged in the middle like a broken back. It was the most forgotten thing in a town full of forgotten things. And in its utter dereliction, Opal felt a strange and immediate kinship. It too had been cast aside, left to rot, deemed worthless by the world that had once relied on it. She walked toward it, the soft mud of the riverbank sucking at her boots, a silent pull toward the wreckage. The barge was called the Osage Queen, though the name was barely legible, a ghost of white paint on the splintered wood of the pilot house. It listed heavily to one side, its hull groaning with every gentle nudge of the current. It smelled of decay, of wet earth and sour, stagnant water. An old man with a face like a dried apple sat on an overturned barrel nearby, whittling a piece of driftwood. He watched her approach with cynical, watery eyes. Something to see, ain't she? He rasped, not bothering to look up from his knife. Pride of the river once. Now she's just holding the bank together. Opal ran a hand over the rough, damp railing. The wood felt strangely solid beneath the rot. Does she belong to anyone? She asked, her voice quiet. The man finally looked up, taking in her dusty dress and the exhaustion etched on her young face. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her feet. Belongs to me, he said, a flicker of something, pity or perhaps opportunity in his gaze. Jebediah's my name, and she's been my burden for 20 years. He saw the way she was looking at the wreck, not with disgust, but with a kind of solemn contemplation. A cruel smile played on his lips. You looking to buy a fine river vessel, missy? The question was a joke, a piece of casual cruelty aimed at a stranger who clearly had nothing. The townspeople who loitered near the saloon had started to watch, their boredom momentarily piqued. Opal felt their eyes on her. She reached into her pocket, and her fingers closed around the cold, smooth edges of the silver dollar. It was everything she had. A foolish, impossible idea began to form, a desperate grasp for a place to belong, no matter how broken. I'll give you $1 for it, she said, her voice steady. Jebediah stared at her, then let out a sharp, barking laugh. The onlookers chuckled. $1? He cackled. For that pile of firewood? It's a deal. He snatched the coin from her outstretched hand before she could reconsider, his eyes gleaming. He scribbled a bill of sale on a scrap of paper from his pocket. His signature a jagged scrawl. She's all yours, girl. Hull, deck, and all the mud she's sitting in. He walked away, still laughing, the silver dollar already destined for a bottle of whiskey. Opal stood there, the flimsy paper in her hand, the new owner of a rotting ship. She stepped onto the deck, and the wood groaned a mournful welcome. It was a ruin, a joke, a monument to failure. But as she stood there alone, with the eyes of the town on her back, it was the first thing in the world that was truly hers. What secret could a forgotten wreck hold? What hope could be found in something so broken? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage. Because as Opal stood on that splintered deck, she had no idea she was standing on a forgotten fortune. The mockery began the next morning. Opal had spent the night huddled in the driest corner of the pilot house, a thin blanket her only comfort against the damp river chill. When the sun rose, it illuminated the full scale of her foolish purchase and the town's derision. Silas Blackwood was the first to give voice to it. He was a man whose own ambitions had run aground years ago, a former river pilot left bitter and beached by the changing times. He stood on the landing, hands on his hips, a smirk twisting his face as he watched Opal trying to sweep a thick carpet of wet leaves from the deck. "Trying to raise the dead, girl?" he called out, his voice carrying across the water. "Some things are best left buried in the mud where they belong." A few men lounging outside the saloon laughed in agreement. From that day on, she was known as the Barge Girl. The name was spoken with a mixture of pity and contempt, a verbal shorthand for youthful folly. When she went to the general store to trade a bit of mending work for a handful of flour and some salt, the storekeeper served her with a brisk, dismissive air, his eyes saying what his mouth did not, that she was wasting her time on a lost cause. The children of the town would sometimes creep down to the water's edge to stare, whispering and pointing at the girl who lived on the ghost ship. Her isolation was absolute. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by a stubbornness she hadn't known she possessed. She patched the worst of the holes in the cabin roof with scavenged tin and tar. She scrubbed the grime from the windows, letting light into the small space for the first time in decades. Her only companion in this lonely work was a scruffy, one-eyed dog that had appeared on the second day. He was as much of an outcast as she was, thin and wary of people. She shared her meager food with him, and he, in turn, offered his silent, steadfast presence. She named him Scupper. One afternoon, as she was wrestling with a warped cabin door, an old woman approached from a small, neat cabin upstream. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, her eyes dark and knowing. This was Ilara, a woman who had lived by the river her whole life and had seen its ebbs and flows, both in water and in fortune. She watched Opal work for a long moment, her silence more observant than judgmental. Opal paused, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of a dirty hand. Ilara pointed a gnarled finger toward the massive, immobile paddle wheel. "That was her heart," the old woman said, her voice dry as rustling leaves. Then she looked directly at Opal, her gaze intense. "Some things ain't meant to move," she said, the words weighted with a strange significance. "They're meant to be listened to." Before Opal could ask what she meant, Ilara turned and walked back to her cabin, leaving the cryptic sentence hanging in the humid air. Opal was left alone with the silent dog, the mocking town, and the immense, stubborn wreck that was now her only home. The old woman's words made no sense, but they settled deep in her mind, a puzzle she couldn't yet solve. The journey to make the barge a home was a battle fought inch by inch against years of neglect. The Osage Queen was more than a wreck. It was a testament to decay. The air inside the main cabin was thick and heavy, a compound of mildew, river mud, and the ghosts of long-extinguished cigars. Opal began by forcing open the swollen doors and windows, letting the breeze and the sunlight lance into the gloom. Armed with a stiff broom she'd fashioned from a willow branch, she attacked the interior. She swept out layers of damp, compacted leaves, nests of forgotten mice, and the fine gray dust of time itself. Scupper would sit in the open doorway, his single eye tracking her movements, his tail giving a soft thump against the floorboards whenever she paused to catch her breath. As she cleared the debris, small artifacts of the barge's former life emerged. She found a brass button from a captain's coat, tarnished to a dull green. A single faded Queen of Hearts playing card lay tucked in a crack in the floor. In a small galley, she discovered a broken porcelain teacup with a delicate hand-painted rose on its side. Holding it, she could almost hear the faint echo of conversation, of laughter, of a life that had once filled these empty spaces. It made her feel less like an intruder and more like a caretaker, a listener to the vessel's silent stories. She spent her first week sleeping on the bank, still wary of the groaning sounds the barge made at night. Wrapped in her blanket, with Scupper curled at her back, she would watch the moon cast the boat's skeletal silhouette onto the dark water. It looked like a beached whale, immense and tragic. But with each passing day of labor, the vessel felt less like a tomb and more like a shelter. She scrubbed the walls, patched the floor, and even found a small, rusted wood stove that, after much effort, she managed to get working. A thin plume of smoke rising from its chimney was a declaration, a sign of life where there had been none. Her focus inevitably turned to the barge's most dominant and broken feature, the giant paddle wheel on the port side. It was wedged fast in the mud, a thicket of gnarled roots woven through its paddles like grasping fingers. It was the source of the barge's list, the anchor that held it captive. To Opal, it represented the heart of the problem. If she could free it, she thought. Maybe she could free the barge itself, make it sit level, make it whole again. It was a foolish, Herculean task for a girl alone, but it was a tangible goal in a life that had become formless. The wheel was the lock, and she was determined to find the key. For days, the paddle wheel resisted her. She waded into the cold, murky water of the Osage, the current pushing against her legs, and worked with a long, heavy iron pry bar she'd found in the engine room. She jammed its tip between the wooden paddles and the tangled roots, putting all of her slight weight into the effort, her muscles screaming in protest. The wheel would groan, the ancient wood would splinter, but it would not budge. The mud held it in a thick, merciless grip. Silas Blackwood and his cronies would watch from the landing, their laughter drifting over the water. "Look at the little bird trying to move a mountain," he'd jeer. Opal learned to shut out the sound of their voices, focusing only on the rhythm of her work, the shove, the strain, the shudder of the wood, the sharp intake of her own breath. She spent hours in the water, her hands becoming raw and calloused, her clothes perpetually damp. One afternoon, exhausted and frustrated, she decided to change her approach. Instead of trying to force the wheel, she would try to understand its prison. She began clearing the debris from around the central axle, the massive hub from which the paddles radiated. She pulled away waterlogged branches, scooped out handfuls of gravel and thick black mud. Her fingers, probing blindly in the cold water behind the axle, brushed against something that didn't belong. It wasn't the rough, splintered texture of the wooden hull, nor the gritty slickness of a river stone. It was a small patch of something hard, unyielding, and unnaturally smooth. Iron. She thought at first it must be an old repair, a plate bolted over a hole. But it felt different. The edges were too clean, the surface too uniform. It was located in a place that made no sense for a simple patch, tucked deep behind the wheel's primary support structure, almost deliberately hidden from view. She tried to dismiss it, to return her focus to the larger task of freeing the wheel, but her mind kept circling back to that strange, cold smoothness. It was an anomaly, a note played in the wrong key. That evening, a summer storm rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised purple. Rain fell in thick, heavy sheets, drumming a frantic rhythm on the newly patched roof of her cabin. The river began to rise, the current quickening. As Opal lay in her bunk, listening to the storm rage outside, she heard the water slapping against the hull. The sound was a familiar, hollow echo, the voice of the wooden boat. But from the area where she had found the iron plate, the sound was different. It wasn't a hollow resonance, but a dull, solid thud. It was the sound of water hitting something that had no give, something that was hiding a space behind it. And in that moment, she remembered Ilara's words. Some things ain't meant to be listened to. She had been listening to the wrong part of the barge. The secret wasn't in what moved, but in what was held fast. The morning after the storm broke clear and bright, the world washed clean. The river was swollen, its muddy water swirling higher up the barge's hull than before. But the urgency Opal felt had nothing to do with the flood risk. The dull, thudding sound from the night before had become an obsession. She knew she had to see what was behind the paddle wheel. She walked into town, her steps more purposeful than they had ever been. She went to the blacksmith, a burly man with soot-stained arms, and asked to borrow a heavy mallet and a cold chisel. He looked her up and down, then glanced toward her barge. He grunted, a sound of reluctant assent, and handed them over. "Don't break 'em," he muttered, clearly expecting that she would. Back at the river, she didn't hesitate. She waded into the chilled, murky water, the tools heavy in her hand. Scupper stood on the bank, whining with a low, anxious hum, his one good eye fixed on her as she disappeared up to her waist. She felt her way back to the spot behind the axle, her bare feet sinking into the soft mud. Her fingers found the smooth iron plate again. It was just as she remembered, cold and incongruous. Taking a deep breath, she positioned the sharp edge of the chisel against the seam where iron met wood and lifted the heavy mallet. The first blow echoed with a sharp crack, sending vibrations up her arm. A chunk of waterlogged wood splintered away. The second blow followed, then a third. It was slow, back-breaking work, performed half-blind in the swirling water. She chipped away at the rotted timbers that framed the plate, peeling back the layers of the boat's skin. Mud and splinters clouded the water around her. With each piece she cleared, more of the iron was revealed. It wasn't a patch. It was a door, a small, square iron door, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, set perfectly flush with the hull. There was no handle, no lock, no visible hinge. As she cleared the last of the wood from its edges, she saw the truth of its construction. The seams were thick, crude lines of melted metal. It had been welded shut, sealed not just against the water, but against discovery. This was not a repair. This was a vault. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide this compartment, and then to hide the fact that it had ever existed. The memory of Alara's cryptic warning returned, this time with the startling clarity of revelation. Some things ain't meant to move. They're meant to be listened to. All her effort, all her straining against the immovable wheel had been misdirected. The wheel wasn't the cage. It was the guard, a massive, silent sentinel placed to protect the secret hidden in its shadow. Opal's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that matched the river's current. This was it, the answer to the barge's strange, solid silence. She tossed the chisel and mallet onto the bank and retrieved the heavy iron pry bar. Her hands, slick with mud and water, trembled as she worked the sharpened tip into a small gap she had created at the corner of the welded door. She planted her feet as firmly as she could in the sucking mud and threw her entire weight against the bar. For a moment, nothing happened. The weld held, a testament to its creator's desperate purpose. Tears of frustration welled in her eyes. All the loneliness, all the grief for her father, all the sting of her stepmother's rejection and the town's mockery. She poured it all into one more heave. A low, groaning screech of tortured metal answered her. A seam split. A thin line of black, foul-smelling water trickled out. Hope surged through her, hot and fierce. She worked the pry bar back and forth, widening the gap. The metal shrieked in protest. With a final, convulsive effort, she wrenched the bar downwards. The door gave way with a sudden, violent lurch, swinging inward into a dark, flooded cavity. She nearly lost her balance, stumbling forward into the hull, reaching into the black, silent space, her breath held tight in her chest. Her hand brushed against something coarse and slick, an oilcloth bundle. It was heavy, weighted down with more than just water. She wrapped her arms around it, her fingers sinking into the bulk of it, and pulled. It came free with a soft, sucking sound. She dragged her prize out of the water and onto the muddy bank, Scupper circling it, sniffing cautiously. Her hands shook so badly she could barely untie the waxed cord that bound the package. She tore at the oilcloth, revealing a collection of objects that had been sealed away from the world. There were 3 large tin canisters, their lids sealed with wax. Beside them lay a thick, leather-bound book, also carefully waterproofed. She picked up the heaviest canister first, prying the lid open with the tip of the pry bar. It was packed tight with sawdust to protect its contents. She plunged her hand in, her fingers closing around a collection of hard, irregular shapes. She pulled one out. It was a dull, greasy-feeling stone, greenish and opaque. But as she turned it in the sunlight, a deep, vibrant fire flashed from within its depths, an emerald, raw and uncut, but unmistakable. She opened the other tins. One was filled with deep blue sapphires, the other with fiery red rubies, a fortune in uncut gems. Her hands trembling, she turned to the leather book. It was a surveyor's field notebook. The pages were filled with meticulous hand-drawn maps of the Osage River and the surrounding hills, alongside precise geological notations. Tucked into a pocket at the very back was a folded, wax-sealed letter. She broke the seal. It was dated 5 years prior, written by a man named Alistair Finch, addressed to a mining syndicate in St. Louis. It described in ecstatic detail the discovery of a major emerald deposit, a veritable river of green stones, hidden in a series of caves accessible only from a specific, unmarked bend in the river miles upstream. The notebook in her lap was the only map. The final lines of the letter sent a chill down her spine. "I have secured my findings in the Queen," Finch had written. "I fear I am being watched. If I do not arrive in St. Louis by the week's end, assume the worst." Opal sat on the muddy bank, the world tilting on its axis. The stones in her lap were not just wealth. They were the legacy of a man who had died for his discovery. Alistair Finch. He must have been the barge's last captain, sealing his life's work into the hull before his enemies caught up with him. The barge wasn't a wreck he'd abandoned. It was a tomb for his secret. The weight of this knowledge was heavier than any of the stones. Just as this new reality began to settle, the threat Finch had feared materialized in the present day. 2 men arrived in Haven's Eddy. They were dressed in city clothes that looked out of place against the town's faded backdrop, their boots polished, their manners smooth but predatory. They made inquiries at the saloon, asking about old river pilots, about a barge that had gone missing years ago. Silas Blackwood, eager for a free drink and a moment of importance, pointed them toward the riverbank. "Ask the barge girl," he said with a smirk. "She knows more about that wreck than anyone." Before they could approach her, however, the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise. The storm that had been threatening all day broke with a terrifying violence. Rain came down not in drops, but in a solid, blinding curtain. The Osage, already swollen, began to churn and rise with alarming speed. A flash flood, water poured over the banks, inundating the low-lying parts of the town. Shouts of alarm cut through the roar of the wind and rain. Opal saw it happen. The small cabin belonging to the Miller family, a young couple with a toddler, was directly in the path of the rising water. The river surged around their home, turning it into an island. They were trapped. The townsfolk stood helpless on higher ground, watching in horror. No one could reach them, but Opal was on the water. Her barge, for all its faults, was a boat. It was her home. Acting on pure instinct, she grabbed a long pole and scrambled onto the deck, Scupper barking at her heels. The Osage Queen groaned as the floodwaters lifted it from the mud that had held it for so long. For the first time in years, it was afloat. It was a clumsy, half-swamped vessel, but Opal, using the pole to push against the riverbed and fend off debris, began to guide it through the treacherous, swirling currents toward the miller's cabin. It was a desperate, terrifying act. The barge fought her, threatening to be swept away. But she held on, her small frame straining, her face set with a fierce resolve. She was no longer just saving herself. She was fighting for others. The barge, the object of so much scorn, was becoming an ark. The Osage Queen lumbered through the churning floodwaters like a great wounded beast, Opal straining at the pole, her knuckles white. She reached the miller's cabin just as the porch was swallowed by the brown torrent. Mr. Miller, his face pale with fear, held his small daughter while his wife prayed. Opal maneuvered the barge's listing deck as close as she could. "Quickly!" she shouted over the storm's roar. With the help of a rope, she threw them. The family scrambled aboard, soaked and shivering, but safe. The rescue was a turning point, not just for the Millers, but for Opal and her relationship with Haven's Eddy. As the floodwaters began to recede the next day, the story of what she had done spread through the town like wildfire. When she poled the barge back to its resting place, she was not met with jeers or suspicious stares, but with a crowd of silent, grateful townspeople. They no longer saw a foolish girl on a pile of wreckage. They saw a hero. Silas Blackwood was there, his usual smirk gone, replaced by an expression of grudging respect. The Miller family couldn't thank her enough, their gratitude a warm and unfamiliar comfort. It was in this new atmosphere of acceptance that the two city men finally approached her. They introduced themselves as representatives of the St. Louis Mineral Syndicate. Their voices were smooth as polished stones, but their eyes were hard. "We understand you've taken possession of this old barge," the taller one said, gesturing vaguely at the Queen. "We're looking for some property that belonged to its former captain, a man named Alistair Finch. A notebook, perhaps." Opal felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, but she did not let the fear show. She stood taller, the memory of her battle against the floodwaters giving her a new kind of strength. She looked them directly in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "This barge belonged to Alistair Finch," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And his findings belong to me now." The men exchanged a look, their polite facade cracking to reveal the menace beneath. But before they could press her further, a new figure stepped forward. It was Mr. Abernathy, the quiet, meticulous land registrar, a man who had barely given her the time of day before. He had heard the story of the rescue, and intrigued, had come to see for himself. Opal, trusting an instinct she didn't know she had, showed him the notebook. Mr. Abernathy adjusted his spectacles, his eyes widening as he examined the precise maps and detailed geological surveys. He traced the lines with a reverent finger. "My word," he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet awe that was more powerful than any shout. "This is a legitimate claim survey. It's all in order." He looked from the notebook to Opal, then to the syndicate men. "And according to the law of salvage and discovery," he stated firmly, "its contents, and the rights they represent, belong to the owner of this vessel." The syndicate men, faced with legal confirmation and the unified stare of the townspeople, knew they were beaten. They turned and left without another word. Silas Blackwood stepped up to Opal, his hat held humbly in his hands. "I misjudged you, miss," he said, his voice low. "That I did." Months passed. The humid heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The Osage River settled back into its banks, and Haven's Eddy began to stir from its long slumber. The news of the Finch discovery, confirmed by geologists brought in by Mr. Abernathy, was a spark in a town that had forgotten the feel of hope. It was not a chaotic gold rush, but something more deliberate, more communal. Under Opal's direction, a small, orderly mining operation began upstream, at the bend in the river so carefully marked on Alistair Finch's map. It provided jobs for Silas Blackwood, Mr. Miller, and others who had been without steady work for years. The sound of hammers and saws returned to the town as old buildings were repaired and new life was breathed into the forgotten streets. The Osage Queen was no longer a wreck. With help from a grateful community, its deck had been replaced, its hull patched properly, and its cabin made into a snug, comfortable home. It floated proudly at the landing, not as a ghost of the past, but as a symbol of the town's unlikely resurrection. Opal never became the aloof mining heiress the world might have expected. The wealth from the emeralds was real, but she treated it as a tool for rebuilding, not as a personal treasure. She established a town fund, repaired the church, and ensured the families of Haven's Eddy had what they needed to thrive. She had found her place not by taking, but by giving back. One evening, as the setting sun cast long shadows across the water, she stood on the deck of the Queen, Scupper resting his head on her feet. Mr. Miller was there, helping her unload supplies. He paused, looking from the restored barge to the lights twinkling on in the reviving town. "I still can't believe it, Opal," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "All that fortune, hidden away right here. What are you going to do now that you can do anything you want?" Opal looked out at the river. Her river. She watched the gentle current, the same water that had tried to destroy and had ultimately saved them. Her gaze drifted to the town, where families were sitting down to dinner in homes that were now secure. She thought of the lonely, frightened girl who had arrived with nothing but a silver dollar and a heart full of grief. She had bought a pile of rotting wood, and in doing so had bought a future. "It was never about what was in the ground," she said, her voice quiet but sure. "It was about finding a place to stand." She had been given $1 to disappear, and with it she had built a home, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey of quiet strength. If you were moved by Opal's story of finding worth in what was thrown away, please leave a like and a comment, and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. We'll see you next time.